I've had a lot of fantastic cups of tea in my life. I've had some perfumey Earl Grey surrounded by American golf tourists at Gleneagle Hotel. I've had spicy chai in a festival field and the breakfast tea my hunky husband brings to ensure I'm a functioning adult before the kids wake up. But I want to tell you about the best cup of tea I have ever tasted. It was the first cup I'd had in 2 days since leaving the house in messy and slightly panicky circumstances. We'd just begun dinner when I felt a rather odd pop and a rush of hot liquid between my legs, followed by some interesting cramping sensations. Now, this story could go in a couple of directions after a start like that, but you'll be pleased to know I was having a baby rather than some kind of gastrointestinal malfunction. We made our way to the labour ward and buzzed the intercom to be let in. I'd worked in that unit, and hardwired into my memory was the fear I'd felt when alarms started ringing and wild-eyed women were rushed along corridors on wheeled beds into operating theatres, or crash team paediatricians hurled suddenly into quiet rooms. So, much as I'd faithfully attended my birthing classes where they taught us to think of the labour pains as surges, and as much as I trusted the people ready to care for me, I was afraid. I remember seeing pictures of a giant sequoia tree which had survived forest fires, and amongst its light brown rings marking the years were black circles where the flames had scarred the growing wood. If you'd sliced me open like one of those trees, you would have seen the dark circles of terror still in me from the fires of emergency deliveries and tragic losses. The hours slowly passed, every miserable prophecy being fulfilled. She was lying face up instead of face down, resulting in hours of her bashing against my pelvis, getting nowhere but bruised and exhausted. I laboured all night with gas and air to find I'd got to only 3 of the required 10 centimetres. I begged for an epidural, and as the merciful numbness spread up from my toes, I told the anaesthetist that I loved him, and if I wasn't already married, he'd have been top pick. My uterus continued its powerful work without bothering the rest of my body at all. Andy grew tired of watching me sleep and headed out for snacks. We laughed as he opened up the bag to reveal the haul from his day's shopping trip, which included licorice all sorts, a Scotch egg and a can of Red Bull. I had another cup of ice chips. Late on day 2, it looked as though progress was being made, so the midwives didn't call the anaesthetist to top up the fading epidural. It can help with the last stages if the mum can feel a wee bit of what's going on when she starts to push. Which is a nice idea, but that meant that I went from pain-free and snoozing to full-on labour in the space of half an hour. No amount of labelling this pain a surge was going to help me now. Eventually, the wee life trying to make her way free was tiring of her ordeal. The heartbeat trace spooling out of the machine attached to my belly was slowing and dipping, and so my old boss, Dr. Stevens, a properly old school consultant in an impeccable white coat, arrived about 10 p.m. He examined me and the wavering black trace and said kindly, "Let's get this baby out now. There are some signs of distress and you've tried your very best, but we need to act immediately." Suddenly, we were an emergency. The black ring in my centre was spreading through my whole self as I nodded and tried to smile professionally and started to cry instead. By now, the pain and the fear were dragging me under the waves and I was drowning. So when a junior doctor arrived to consent me for emergency caesarean section, I was not best pleased. The poor chap did his best to talk me through the risks and complications of surgery while the contraction built, until I grabbed the chewed ballpoint from his hand and yelled, "I've done your fucking job! Give me the fucking form!" I bore more than a passing resemblance to Linda Blair in The Exorcist. As the pain faded, I was horrified at myself, apologizing frantically. "I'm so sorry, I'm a nice person. I don't usually swear, honestly. Andy, tell him." The form signed. The power of a theatre porter compelled me through a subterranean corridor, midwives at my side. Andy was left behind to change into a set of scrubs and Crocs from the staff changing room. I stared up at the ceiling light as they wiped my belly with ocean-smelling brown iodine solution, suddenly shaking from cold and adrenaline. The anaesthetist fiddled with the epidural, converting it to stronger numbing in readiness for surgery, and Dr. Stephen started the first incision. Junior doctor opposite him on my left side, midwife over his right shoulder, handing over sterile instruments from the tray. I knew how this went. I'd been the junior on the left, holding the retractor, applying pressure when orders were issued. I'd also been the paediatrician standing in the far corner, oxygen tested, blankets warming under the light, breath held for the first cry that would signal a safe delivery, or the terrible absence of it that meant action stations. As the scalpel started its decisive sweep from right to left, I felt a horrific sensation, a burning slice of pain above my pelvis. I could feel him cutting. I could feel him cutting. I can feel him cutting me, I screamed at the anaesthetist on my left, at anyone who would listen. No one did anything. I can feel him cutting me. What's she saying? She asked Andy, sitting white-faced behind my right shoulder. He leaned in. Terror had stolen my scream, replacing it with a tiny whisper. I whisper-screamed one more time. I can feel it. Finally, I was heard, and over my head passed a large syringe full of white liquid. Propofol was being pushed swiftly into the vein on the back of my hand, icy and sharp. Glorious sleepiness descended, and the operating theatre faded to a bright speck in the black, like an old-fashioned TV being switched off. I could see why Michael Jackson found it so Moorish. I woke alone, in a different room, windows high on the walls, so that I felt as though I was at the bottom of a swimming pool. It was daylight outside, and I could see a patch of blue sky and some white cloud. I had no idea how long I'd been asleep or what had happened after I drifted away on my propofol. Just the vague feeling you have when you wake up from a dream with a sense of something important you were supposed to remember. Turning my head, I realised I wasn't alone after all. In a clear plastic box on a metal frame, a tiny white wrap form topped with a pink knitted beanie was just visible. She was here. And if she was next to me with no oxygen and no paediatrician, just here in my room, that meant we must both be okay. The door opened quietly, and a midwife popped a kind head in to ask if I wanted a bath. All of a sudden, that was the thing I wanted most in the world. If she'd asked me 2 days before if I'd allow myself to be undressed and washed with a soapy flannel while lying on a plastic sheet, I'd have been appalled. But just then it was almost too perfect. To be treated like a tired child after a long day, my exhausted limbs held in gentle hands, my sweat-soaked hair and face wiped clean, and a fresh nightdress slipped over my head was utter delight. Let me get you tea and toast, she smiled, leaving the room for a few minutes and returning with a tray. I found myself swimming back up into myself, reaching for the tea as though reaching for a life belt. Propped up on the pillows, I cradled that white stoneware mug. It was sturdy and thick-rimmed, scuffed on the inside from years of stirring teaspoons. The tea was standard issue, NHS bulk buy breakfast, industrial strength tannins and scalding hot. It was the most delicious thing that had ever crossed my lips. Better than the overpriced loose leaf tea in the 5-star hotel, or unfurling jasmine buds, or spicy chai. So, if you ask me to recommend the ideal cup of tea, do be careful. I'm likely to suggest that the very best tea is the one after 48 hours of labour, fetal distress, a failed epidural, and an emergency caesarean section.